There are seasons in the believer's journey when heaven feels like brass. You pray, you plead, you weep, and yet there is no answer. The sky seems closed, the heart feels faint, and faith begins to stagger under the weight of waiting. Many in this generation understand that silence. We've fasted, we've cried, and still, God seems quiet. But child of God, what if I told you that heaven's silence is not heaven's rejection? What if I told you that sometimes God's quiet is His greatest classroom, where He births endurance, refines faith, and reveals His heart in ways words never could? George Müller, the man who fed thousands of orphans without ever asking a soul for help, knew this silence well. He didn't live in a world of instant answers. There were times the cupboards were empty, the rent was due, and his staff looked at him with fearful eyes, and yet there was no sound from heaven, no flash of angels, no voice of thunder, no miraculous bread falling from the sky. There was only silence. But in that silence, Müller learned the rarest secret. Faith is not proven in the answered prayer. It is proven in the waiting. He would often say that faith ends where sight begins. It's easy to trust God when the provision has come, when the doors open, when the miracle manifests. But when God hides His face, when time stretches longer than your endurance, when every door you knock on stays shut, that is where faith either collapses or matures. And Müller chose to mature. He didn't panic. He didn't manipulate. He didn't beg people for help. He took the silence of God as an invitation, not a punishment. He knelt on his knees and said, "Lord, if you are silent, I will stay here until you speak. If you choose not to speak, I will still trust what you have heard." That is the faith this world has forgotten. We are surrounded by instant culture, instant food, instant fame, instant results, and now, we want instant God. But God does not bend to our hurry. He builds men and women of depth through waiting. The seed must sit buried before it bursts into fruit. The promise must go through winter before spring arrives. Abraham waited 25 years for Isaac. Joseph waited in a prison before the palace. David waited in caves before the crown. Jesus waited 30 years before He preached one sermon. Waiting is not a waste. It is divine preparation. Müller said that often the delay of an answer is a greater blessing than the answer itself, because it teaches the soul to lean wholly on God. Imagine the orphans in His care, hundreds of mouths to feed, and the kitchen empty. Imagine the workers, whispering in worry. Yet, Müller refused to move until heaven moved. One morning, there was literally no food left for breakfast. The children were seated, the plates empty, and he said calmly, "Let us give thanks." As they bowed their heads, there was a knock on the door. A baker stood there. Saying he couldn't sleep the night before, God told him to bake extra bread. Moments later, a milk cart broke down in front of the orphanage, and the milkman offered to give them all the milk before it spoiled. That day, heaven broke its silence, but not before testing the faith that dared to wait. Oh, how God loves a soul that will trust Him in the dark. Psalm 37 verse 7 says, "Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for Him." And Isaiah 30 verse 18 declares, "Blessed are all they that wait for Him." God is not testing you to destroy you. He is shaping your confidence in His character. For when you know who He is, you can endure what He allows. Faith that cannot wait is not faith. It is impatience wearing religious clothing. But when faith learns to wait, it becomes unbreakable. There are some listening to this now. You've prayed for years for that healing, that breakthrough, that child, that open door, that revival. You've cried until you have no tears left. You wonder, has God forgotten me? No, beloved. He has engraved you upon His palms. The silence you feel is not abandonment. It's alignment. God is setting the stage for a glory that would have been too small if He had answered too soon. You see, Müller could have asked rich men to help. He could have written letters of appeal. But he didn't, because his mission was not just to feed orphans. It was to prove to a doubting world that God still hears prayer. That's why heaven's silence was sacred. If God had answered immediately every time, there would be no witness of perseverance. But because Müller waited, the world saw what patient faith can do. Beloved, sometimes God delays to magnify Himself. Remember when Lazarus was sick? Jesus stayed 2 days longer. Why? Because healing would have been wonderful, but resurrection would be glorious. And when he finally came, Martha cried, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The delay was not denial, it was divine design. This is what George Müller understood so deeply. He wasn't moved by visible circumstances, because he had trained his heart to listen for invisible assurances. Faith does not operate in the realm of the possible, he said. There is no glory for God in that, which is humanly possible. When God seems silent, he is teaching you to walk without the crutches of sight. He is saying, "Will you still believe me when you can't trace me?" Some of the most powerful moments in the Christian life are not when the prayer is answered, but when the believer refuses to give up praying even when nothing changes. It is when you still go to church when you feel spiritually dry, when you still lift your hands in worship though your heart feels heavy, when you still sow in tears believing that you will reap in joy. That is where spiritual muscles are built. Müller's faith did not grow in abundance but in adversity. Every trial became another testimony. Every delay became another doorway to divine revelation. He learned that God's silence was not God's absence. In fact, it was the silence that made him lean in more deeply. Too often, we interpret silence as punishment. But in truth, silence is intimacy. It is God saying, "Stay close, even when you can't hear me." Child of God, can you stay close in the quiet? Can you keep praying when the heavens are still? Can you keep giving when there's nothing left to give? Can you keep forgiving when there's no apology? Can you still trust that He is good when life doesn't look good? That's where the saints are forged. That's where revival begins, not in the noise of crowds, but in the quiet of surrender. Look at Habakkuk. He cried out for justice, and God seemed silent. But by the end of the book, he said, "Though the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation." That's the kind of faith George Müller lived. A faith that rejoices before the breakthrough. A faith that praises before the answer. Today, heaven is still looking for such people. Not perfect people, but persistent ones. Not talented, but trusting. Not loud, but loyal. People who will stand like Müller and say, "Though he slayed me, yet will I trust him." The world needs that witness again. A faith unshaken by delay. A church that knows how to wait well. A believer who says, "If God is silent, I will still sing." Maybe God's silence right now is His way of stretching your capacity for glory. Because when He finally speaks, it won't just answer your prayer, it will restore your faith, bless generations, and shake nations. So don't lose heart. Don't quit praying. Don't give up waiting. The same God who broke the silence for George Müller will break it for you. Until then, wait with worship. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord.